A police officer arrested a disabled black girl in a park, but everything changed when Barack Obama's motorcade pulled up. What happened next will make you wonder. Watch to the end and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The late morning sun bathed the park in a golden glow, casting long, lazy shadows over the neatly trimmed grass. Birds chirped overhead, their songs blending with the distant laughter of children playing on the swings and slides. The scent of blooming flowers mixed with the faint aroma of popcorn from a vendor's cart stationed near the fountain. It was the kind of day that made the world feel kinder, lighter. A day when nothing bad should happen. Kyla Brooks sat near the edge of the playground, her wheelchair parked beside a shaded bench where her aunt, Lorraine, thumbed through a well-worn paperback novel. Kyla's small hands moved deftly across her sketch pad, pencil strokes capturing the park's beauty. The arc of the fountain's spray, the vibrant petals of the flowers, the flurry of motion from the kids running past. Her lips pressed together in concentration, a light furrow creasing her brow as she tried to get the shading just right. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Lorraine said, glancing over her book. She leaned forward, adjusting the brim of her wide sun hat to shield her eyes from the glare. "You're getting better every day." Kyla beamed at the compliment. "Thanks, Auntie. I think I'm finally figuring out how to make the water look real." She tilted the sketch pad so Lorraine could see the reflection she'd carefully drawn rippling across the fountain's surface. "Real enough to make me thirsty," Lorraine teased, reaching into her bag for a bottle of water and offering it to Kyla. "You want some?" Kyla shook her head. "I'm okay." She reached for her colored pencils, beginning to add streaks of blue and green to the page. Her smile lingered, but a shadow of worry flitted across her eyes as she caught sight of the other kids in the park. They darted around the slides and jungle gym with effortless energy, their laughter echoing in the air. Kyla didn't envy them, at least that's what she told herself. She'd gotten used to her wheelchair in the years since the accident. It wasn't her legs that made her different. It was the way people looked at her. Pitying glances, curious stares. Some kids asked questions she didn't mind answering. Others whispered and pointed. It wasn't mean exactly, but it made her feel like she didn't quite fit. Still, she brushed the thoughts aside. Today was a good day, and she wasn't going to ruin it by feeling sorry for herself. She turned back to her sketch pad and focused on the colors. The peace of the moment shattered when a shadow fell over her paper. "Afternoon," came a sharp voice. Kyla looked up and froze. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a police uniform loomed over her, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting her own startled expression. "Is there a problem, officer?" Lorraine asked, standing quickly and stepping protectively closer to Kyla. The man didn't look at Lorraine. His eyes, hidden behind the glasses, stayed locked on Kyla. "You have a permit to be here?" he asked, his tone flat. Lorraine blinked. "A permit?" She glanced around the park. Families sprawled on picnic blankets, kids tossed frisbees, couples strolled hand in hand. No one else had been asked for a permit. "I wasn't aware we needed one," Lorraine said slowly, keeping her voice calm. The officer adjusted his belt, the metal of his holster catching the sunlight. "This area's for recreational activity, not—" He gestured vaguely toward Kyla's wheelchair. "This?" Kyla's heart pounded in her chest. She felt her fingers tighten around her colored pencil, snapping the tip. "This?" Lorraine's voice rose slightly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I'm not here to argue, ma'am," the officer said, finally turning to look at her. His tone was clipped, impatient. I need to see some identification, and I need you both to move along." "Move along?" Lorraine's voice sharpened. "She's a child, officer. She's not bothering anyone. She's sitting here, minding her own business." "Ma'am," he cut her off, "I'm not going to repeat myself." Kyla's breathing quickened. The officer's presence, the hardness in his voice, the weight of his gaze, it was suffocating. She'd read stories about things like this, seen videos online of police encounters that spiraled out of control. She never thought it would happen to her. She reached for Lorraine's hand, but the officer stepped closer, and Lorraine moved in front of Kyla's wheelchair. "You need to step aside," the officer said, placing one hand on his belt. "No," Lorraine shot back. "Not until you explain why you're treating my niece like a criminal." The officer's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything harder," Lorraine snapped. "You're the one who—" "Enough." The officer grabbed Lorraine's arm, pulling her aside as Kyla cried out. "Stop!" Kyla shouted, but her voice broke, trembling. Ignoring her, the officer knelt by the wheelchair and grabbed the handles. "You need to come with me," he said. Kyla recoiled. "I didn't do anything." "You're resisting," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Lorraine broke free, lunging toward them, but another officer, this one younger, with a stiff expression, approached and blocked her. Kyla's vision blurred with tears as the cold metal snapped around her wrists, binding them together. She felt the wheels of her chair shift as the officer started pushing her toward his patrol car. "No, please," she begged. "You can't do this." But the officer didn't stop. The world seemed to tilt, the sunny day turning heavy and dark. The children's laughter faded, replaced by the sound of Kyla's own panicked breathing. And then it happened. Engines rumbled, tires crunched against gravel. The crowd parted as 3 sleek black SUVs rolled up to the curb, their tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. Doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise and practiced. The lead car's door swung open, and a tall man emerged. His face was familiar, too familiar. It was Barack Obama. The officer pushing Kyla's chair froze mid-step. The younger officer by Lorraine's side stiffened. The crowd, now twice as large, began murmuring in disbelief. Barack Obama stepped forward, his expression calm but commanding. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, landing on Kyla, then on the officer holding her chair. "Is there a problem here?" Obama asked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. For the first time since the encounter began, Kyla felt hope. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an unspoken command. All eyes were on the man who had just stepped out of the sleek black SUV. He moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had once held the highest office in the land. Even though Barack Obama was no longer President of the United States, his presence demanded attention. The officer, gripping Kyla's wheelchair, faltered for just a second before tightening his hold, his knuckles turning white. Kyla's wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto Obama's, searching for something. Hope, reassurance, safety. And she saw it there, in his calm yet unyielding expression. The crowd shifted, some people raising their phones to capture the unfolding scene. The other officer, the younger one who had been guarding Lorraine, took a nervous step back, clearly recognizing the man who had just arrived. Obama strode forward, his gaze never leaving the older officer. His security detail remained close, their sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, but none of them intervened. This wasn't their moment. It was his. "Is there a problem here?" Obama's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. The officer cleared his throat, but the words seemed to catch. He finally managed to speak, his voice tighter than before. "Sir, this is a police matter. I'm handling it." "Handling it?" Obama echoed, his brow furrowing as he looked at Kyla, her wrists still bound by the cold metallic cuffs. "Is this your definition of handling it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're handcuffing a child." The officer bristled. She was being non-compliant. Obama raised an eyebrow, taking a slow step closer. Non-compliant? What exactly did this little girl do that warranted being treated like a criminal? The officer hesitated, but his pride forced him to keep pushing. "I asked for identification, sir. They refused to cooperate." Lorraine, who had been frozen in place, suddenly found her voice. "We didn't refuse anything. He started harassing us for no reason. My niece was sitting here drawing, and this. Her voice cracked with anger as she gestured toward the officer. "He accused her of not belonging." Obama's jaw tightened, and he turned back to the officer. "You accused a child in a wheelchair of not belonging? Is that what I'm hearing?" "I was enforcing the rules," the officer said quickly, his voice defensive now. "What rules?" Obama asked, his tone sharp. "Show me the rule book that says a child can't sit in a park and draw pictures. Go ahead, I'll wait." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence only made the murmurs in the crowd grow louder. People began to inch closer, emboldened by Obama's presence. Obama looked back at Kyla. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Kyla," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hi, Kyla." His voice softened as he crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "I know you're scared, but you're going to be okay. I promise." She nodded, barely able to form words, but the look of trust in her eyes was unmistakable. Standing up again, Obama's expression hardened. "Take the cuffs off her, now." The officer hesitated. "Sir, now," Obama repeated, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. The younger officer stepped forward quickly, fumbling with the key before the older officer could respond. The cuffs clicked open, and Kyla let out a shaky breath, rubbing her sore wrists. Obama gestured to one of his security agents, who immediately handed Kyla a bottle of water. "Drink this," he said gently, "and breathe. You're safe now." The crowd erupted into murmurs of relief and support. Some people clapped, others shouted words of encouragement. Lorraine rushed to Kyla's side, hugging her tightly and whispering reassurances. But Obama wasn't done. He turned back to the officers, his eyes hard. "You've just made a very big mistake." "Sir." "No," Obama interrupted. "You don't speak right now. You listen. I don't care what kind of justification you think you have for this behavior, but it stops here. Today. I want your names and badge numbers, and I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." The younger officer quickly produced his ID, stammering out his name. Officer Daniels. The older one, Officer Hanks, hesitated, but eventually followed suit, muttering his information under his breath. Obama handed the details off to one of his aides. "Start making calls," he said. "I want an official complaint filed before we leave this park." Turning back to the crowd, he raised his voice. "I need everyone who witnessed this to stay here. We're going to take statements, and I encourage anyone with footage to share it with my team." Phones were already raised, recording everything. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. They knew this wasn't just about Kyla. It was about something much bigger. Obama returned his focus to Kyla. "Do you have someone you can call? A parent?" "My mom," Kyla said softly. "She's at work." "Let's call her," Obama said, nodding toward Lorraine. "She needs to know what happened." Lorraine pulled out her phone, her hands still trembling. As she dialed, Obama crouched beside Kyla again. "You're very brave," he told her, "and what happened to you today was wrong, but you didn't let it break you. That's strength, Kyla. Don't forget that." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from relief. Lorraine handed the phone to Kyla. "It's your mom," she said softly. Kyla pressed the phone to her ear. "Mom?" Her voice cracked and the tears finally spilled over. "I'm okay," she said quickly before her mother could panic. "I'm okay." The call was short but filled with emotion. When it ended, Kyla looked back at Obama. "Thank you," she whispered. Obama smiled, but there was a fire behind his eyes as he stood. "We're not done yet, Kyla. I promise you that." He turned back to the officers. "You'll both be hearing from the Department of Justice," he said, his voice like iron. "I'll make sure of it." The officers didn't argue this time. They stood stiffly, knowing their careers, and possibly more, hung in the balance. Obama walked back to his car, but before he climbed inside, he turned and looked at Kyla one more time. "Stay strong," he said. And with that, the convoy pulled away, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered. The world had taken notice. And for Kyla, this was only the beginning. Kyla sat in the back seat of her aunt's car, staring blankly out the window as the city blurred past her. The trembling in her hands hadn't stopped since the cuffs had come off, and the memory of the cold metal biting into her wrist lingered like a phantom pain. Lorraine kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, her lips pressed tightly together, but she didn't say much. Neither of them had found the words yet. The radio murmured in the background, but Kyla wasn't listening until she heard her name. "Breaking news," the voice said. "A confrontation between a police officer and a young black girl in a wheelchair has sparked outrage after former President Barack Obama intervened at the scene earlier today. Videos of the incident have already gone viral on social media, prompting calls for an immediate investigation into the officers involved." Kyla's stomach tightened. She had known people were recording. Phones had been everywhere, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. Her name was out there. Her face, her fear. Lorraine turned the volume down and reached back to squeeze Kyla's hand. "Don't listen to that right now," she said softly. "We're almost home." But Kyla wasn't sure home would feel the same anymore. When they pulled into the driveway, Kyla's mom was already there, pacing anxiously on the porch. As soon as the car stopped, she ran to the door, yanking it open before Kyla could even unbuckle her seatbelt. "Baby!" she cried, pulling Kyla into a hug so tight it hurt. "Oh my God, are you okay? Are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm okay," Kyla said quickly, even though her voice shook. "I'm okay, Mom." Her mom didn't look convinced. She knelt down, brushing Kyla's hair back from her face and checking her over like she didn't believe her own eyes. It wasn't until she saw the faint red marks on Kyla's wrists that she froze, her expression hardening. "They put handcuffs on you?" Kyla looked away. "Yeah." Her mom's breath hitched. For a moment, it looked like she might cry, but then the tears disappeared behind something sharper. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot." Inside, the house felt smaller than usual, like the walls were pressing in. The living room was filled with family members who had rushed over as soon as they heard. Kyla's grandparents, her cousins, even her uncle who usually stayed out of things. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, and Kyla did her best to explain without falling apart. But it was hard. Every time she tried to describe the officer's face or the sound of the cuffs clicking shut, her voice wavered. It wasn't until she mentioned Obama stepping in that the mood in the room shifted. He was just there, Kyla said, still not quite believing it herself. And he stopped them. He told them to take the cuffs off, and they listened. That man is a hero, her grandmother said, shaking her head. I knew it the day I voted for him. Hero or not, her mom cut in, this isn't going away quietly. We need a lawyer, and we need to make sure those officers don't get away with this. Kyla barely had time to process what was happening before the phone calls started. Reporters, activists, even politicians, all wanting interviews, statements, reactions. Her mom and aunt tried to shield her, but the noise was impossible to block out. Meanwhile, the videos kept spreading. Clips of Obama walking up to the officers, demanding answers, standing between Kyla and her cuffs. It was everywhere. And with it came the questions. Why did this happen? How often does it happen? And what are we going to do about it? The next morning, the protest started. Crowds gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Kyla" and "No more abuse of power." Activists gave speeches. News crews circled the area. And inside the station, Officers Hanks and Daniels sat in an empty room, their faces pale as the chief of police paced back and forth in front of them. "This is a disaster," the chief said, slamming a folder down on the table. "A national disaster. Do you have any idea who you just tangled with?" "We were following protocol," Hank said defensively, though the sweat on his forehead suggested otherwise. "Protocol?" The chief's voice rose. "Protocol doesn't include handcuffing a 10-year-old girl in a wheelchair. Protocol doesn't include getting called out by a former president on camera. Do you even realize what's happening out there?" Neither officer responded. "Of course you don't," the chief snapped, "because you weren't thinking. And now the entire department is under investigation." He pointed at Daniels. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Then he turned to Hanks. "And you, don't even think about coming back here until this is sorted out. Get out of my sight." Outside, the protests grew louder. People chanted Kyla's name, demanding justice not just for her, but for every child who had ever been treated like less than a person. Kyla watched it all unfold from home, her hands still trembling as she scrolled through the news. She saw the videos of the protesters, the headlines about Obama's intervention, the arguments online between people who supported her and people who didn't. And then she saw something else, a message. It was from Barack Obama. "Kyla," it read, "I hope you're doing okay today. I wanted to let you know that I've spoken to the Department of Justice, and they're launching a formal investigation into what happened. You're not alone in this fight. Stay strong." Kyla stared at the screen, rereading the words until her eyes blurred. She didn't feel strong, not yet. But maybe with people like Obama standing beside her, she could be. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and interviews. Kyla's mom hired a lawyer, and Obama's team helped coordinate the legal strategy. Witnesses came forward with statements. Footage from the officers' body cameras was released, showing just how quickly the situation had escalated, and how little justification there had been for it. And, through it all, Kyla kept drawing. At first, it was just to calm her nerves, but soon her sketches became something more. She started drawing the protesters, the crowds, the signs calling for justice. She drew Obama standing tall in front of the officers, and she drew herself, smaller but unbroken. People began sharing her drawings online, calling them symbols of resilience. art galleries reached out, asking to display her work. And slowly, Kyla began to feel like she wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice. But the fight was far from over. As the investigation continued, more details about Hanks emerged: complaints of misconduct, a pattern of targeting minorities, allegations that had been brushed aside for years. And now, finally, he was being held accountable. But Kyla knew it wasn't just about him. It was about changing a system that let people like him operate unchecked. It was about making sure no other child had to go through what she had. And as the protests continued and the investigation heated up, Kyla realized something else. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, and it was just getting started. Kyla sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her, but for the first time in days, she couldn't bring herself to draw. The half-finished picture of the protesters outside the police station stared back at her, the lines sharp and jagged. She set down her pencil and rubbed at the faint marks on her wrists, even though the physical pain was long gone. The feeling lingered anyway, like a ghost she couldn't shake. The house buzzed with noise, phone calls, emails, reporters knocking at the door, but Kyla felt strangely disconnected from it all. Her mom paced in the living room, her voice rising and falling as she argued with someone over the phone. Her Aunt Lorraine sat at the table with her laptop, furiously typing out responses to journalists and organizers. Kyla had never liked being the center of attention. Now it felt like the entire world was looking at her. A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She looked up as her mom hurried to answer it. "Kyla," her mom called, her voice softer than it had been all day, "you've got a visitor." Barack Obama stepped into the kitchen, ducking slightly as if he still wasn't used to the low ceilings of ordinary houses. He smiled at Kyla, but there was a seriousness behind his eyes that made her sit up straighter. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Kyla shook her head quickly, and he pulled out a chair across from her. Her mom lingered in the doorway for a moment, then gave Kyla a reassuring look and stepped out to give them privacy. For a long moment, Obama just looked at her sketchbook. "You're good," he said finally, flipping carefully through the pages. "Really good." "Thanks," Kyla murmured, twisting her pencil in her fingers. He closed the sketchbook and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "How are you holding up?" Kyla hesitated. She wanted to say she was fine, that she was strong, like everyone kept telling her, but the truth bubbled up before she could stop it. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's a lot." Obama nodded. "It is. And it's okay to feel that way." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise from the rest of the house faded, leaving just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I wanted to check on you," Obama said, "but I also wanted to talk to you about what comes next." Kyla's stomach tightened. "Next?" "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "The investigation is moving forward, but we can't stop there. What happened to you isn't just about you, Kyla. It's about something bigger. And people are paying attention now. They're listening." Kyla swallowed hard. She had seen the news reports, the headlines, the interviews with protesters and activists. She had read the messages people sent her, stories about their own experiences, their own fears. But she still didn't feel like the person they thought she was. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Obama said, "but you have a voice, and people need to hear it." Kyla looked down at her sketchbook. "I don't think I'm brave enough for that." Obama smiled, but there was a weight behind it. You think I wasn't scared the first time I stood in front of a crowd and spoke about injustice? I was terrified, but I did it anyway, because it wasn't about me. It was about the people who didn't have the chance to speak for themselves. Kyla felt the words settle over her, heavy and solid, but grounding somehow. "Will you help me?" she asked quietly. "I'll be there every step of the way," he promised. Over the next few days, Kyla's life became even busier. With Obama's team helping to organize, she prepared for her first public appearance, a rally outside City Hall where she would speak alongside activists and community leaders. Kyla spent hours rehearsing what she wanted to say, but nothing felt right. The words stuck in her throat whenever she practiced in front of the mirror. She wasn't like the people she saw on TV, strong, confident, unshakable. She was just a kid in a wheelchair who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The morning of the rally, Kyla felt sick to her stomach. She sat in the car with her mom and Lorraine, staring out the window as the crowd came into view. There were hundreds of people packed into the square, holding signs and chanting slogans. A stage had been set up at the front, and Kyla could already see the cameras waiting. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. Her mom turned around in the front seat. "Yes, you can." "What if I mess up?" "Then you mess up," her mom said simply. "But you get back up and keep going, because that's what we do." Kyla didn't feel convinced, but she nodded anyway. When they reached the stage, Obama was waiting. He knelt beside her wheelchair, adjusting the microphone to her height. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. He laughed. "Good. That means you care." When it was her turn to speak, Kyla rolled up to the microphone and stared out at the sea of faces. For a moment, her voice caught in her throat. But then she saw the signs. Justice for Kyla. No more abuse. Stop the violence. And she remembered what Obama had said. It wasn't about her. She took a deep breath and started speaking. "My name is Kyla Brooks," she said. "And a week ago I was just a kid sitting in a park drawing pictures. But someone looked at me and didn't see a kid. They saw a problem. They saw someone who didn't belong." The crowd fell silent. I was scared. I thought maybe if I was polite, if I followed the rules, it would be okay. But it wasn't. And it's not okay. It's not okay for me, and it's not okay for anyone else. The words came easier now. We talk about justice, but justice isn't just a word, it's action. It's making sure no one else has to feel the way I felt that day, and I'm asking all of you to take action with me. The crowd erupted into cheers. Kyla felt the fear in her chest give way to something stronger. Hope. When she rolled off the stage, Obama was waiting. "You did good, Kyla," he said, smiling. But Kyla didn't feel finished. "This isn't over," she said. "No," Obama agreed. "It's just the beginning." The courtroom was colder than Kyla expected. The high ceilings and polished wooden benches made everything feel formal, almost intimidating. She sat beside her mom and aunt at the plaintiff's table, her small frame barely visible above the polished surface. The same hands that once trembled in fear now rested firmly on the arms of her wheelchair. Her sketchbook lay closed in her lap, a silent companion she carried as both comfort and armor. The room buzzed with energy, filled with reporters, activists, and members of the community who had come to witness what had become one of the most high-profile trials of the year. Signs and chants still echoed faintly outside, reminders of the protests that had never let up since her arrest. Kyla's heart thumped as the bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. She stood, or rather, her mom gently turned her wheelchair to face the bench as the judge entered, his black robe flowing. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The room fell silent as Judge Malcolm Davis took his seat. He was an older black man, his graying hair and sharp eyes giving him an air of quiet authority. Kyla had met him briefly before the proceedings, and the warmth in his voice as he asked about her drawings had eased some of her nerves. Now, though, he looked every bit the impartial figure of justice. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice steady. "We are here to hear the case of Brooks versus Officers Hanks and Daniels, charged with misconduct, abuse of authority, and excessive force." Kyla's eyes flickered toward the defense table. Officers Hanks and Daniels sat stiffly in their uniforms, their expressions neutral but tight. Hanks avoided her gaze entirely, while Daniels shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of the room. Their lawyer, a sharp-faced man in a gray suit, whispered something to Hanks, who nodded stiffly. Kyla's own lawyer, a tall woman named Michelle Harris, leaned down and gave Kyla a reassuring smile. "You're ready for this," she whispered. Kyla nodded, even as her stomach churned. The opening statements began, with Michelle rising first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, stepping forward, "this case is not just about a little girl in a wheelchair. It's about power, the abuse of it, and the impact it has on the most vulnerable members of our community." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You will hear how Kyla Brooks was targeted, humiliated, and treated like a criminal for simply existing in a public park, a space where she had every right to be. You will see video evidence of officers escalating a peaceful situation into one of fear and intimidation. And you will hear testimony that proves this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of discrimination." Michelle turned to the jury, her voice firm. "We ask you to send a message today. A message that no child, no person, should ever feel unsafe because of the color of their skin or the condition of their body." The defense attorney stood next. "This case," he began, "is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. My clients were doing their jobs, protecting the public and ensuring safety. While we regret that Miss Brooks felt frightened, we intend to show that the officers acted in accordance with department policies and protocols." Kyla flinched at the word protocols. It sounded so cold, so impersonal, as if her fear and humiliation were just paperwork to be filed away. The testimony started with the witnesses. Several people who had been in the park that day recounted what they had seen: the officer's aggressive approach, Kyla's terrified reaction, and Obama's intervention. Videos from bystanders played on a large screen, the images sharp and undeniable. When it was Kyla's turn, she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair and rolled forward. The courtroom felt too big, too loud, but she forced herself to meet the judge's eyes as she was sworn in. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," she said, her voice steady. Michelle began the questioning gently. "Kyla, can you tell us what you were doing in the park that day?" "I was drawing," Kyla said, her voice growing a little stronger. "I like to draw landscapes, and I was sketching the fountain." "And what happened when Officer Hanks approached you?" Kyla swallowed hard. "He asked me for a permit, but I didn't know what he was talking about. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just wanted to draw." She described everything: how he made her feel like she didn't belong, how he ignored her aunt's protests, and how scared she'd felt when the cuffs clicked shut. Her voice cracked once, but she didn't stop. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, his questions were sharp, but Kyla didn't falter. "You said you were scared," he said. "Is it possible you misinterpreted the officer's intentions?" "No," Kyla said firmly. I know what it feels like to be scared, and I know when someone's treating me like I'm not a person." Her words hung in the air, and even the defense attorney looked momentarily unsettled. Barack Obama took the stand next. The room shifted the moment he walked up, his presence commanding attention. He recounted the events with precision, highlighting the officer's unprofessionalism and the unnecessary escalation of force. "These officers didn't see a child," he said, his voice ringing out across the courtroom. "They saw a threat where there was none. And if I hadn't been there, I shudder to think what might have happened next." The defense attorney tried to push back, suggesting Obama's presence had influenced perceptions, but Obama remained unshaken. "If my presence changed the outcome," he said, "then maybe we should ask ourselves why these officers acted one way when they thought no one was watching, and another when they realized someone was." The prosecution presented body camera footage next, and the evidence was damning. Hank's words, dismissive, demeaning, and laced with prejudice, played loud and clear. The jury flinched when the sound of the cuffs locking echoed through the room. When the closing arguments came, Michelle's voice was steady. "This case is about accountability," she said. "Kyla Brooks didn't just face two officers that day. She faced a system that allowed them to act without fear of consequences. Today, you have the power to change that." The defense's final plea for leniency fell flat. The jury deliberated for hours, but Kyla didn't leave the courthouse. She sat in a quiet room with her family, Obama checking in periodically. When the verdict finally came, the tension broke like a thunderclap. "Guilty," the foreman said, "on all counts." Kyla's mom burst into tears. Lorraine hugged her so tightly Kyla could barely breathe. The courtroom erupted, cheers, shouts, applause, but Kyla just sat there, stunned. It was over, or at least this part was. Obama knelt beside her wheelchair, his voice low. "This is a victory," he said, "but it's not the end, it's a beginning." And as Kyla rolled out of the courtroom and into the sunlight, she knew he was right. The sunlight outside the courthouse felt different, warmer, brighter, like it carried the weight of everything that had just happened. Kyla sat in her wheelchair at the top of the courthouse steps, the roar of the crowd below washing over her. Signs waved in the air, slogans shouted in rhythm, but all she could focus on was the feeling in her chest. Relief. The word guilty echoed in her ears, not just a verdict, but a declaration that what had been done to her was wrong, and that someone was finally being held accountable for it. The weight she had carried since that day in the park didn't disappear, but it felt lighter somehow. Her mom knelt beside her, tears still wet on her cheeks. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she said, squeezing Kyla's hand. So proud." Kyla's Aunt Lorraine stood behind her, one hand on Kyla's shoulder. "You showed them what it means to stand tall," she said, even though Kyla was sitting. "Don't ever forget that." The crowd surged forward as Barack Obama emerged from the courthouse, his security detail close behind. He walked straight toward Kyla, smiling as he crouched down so their eyes were level. "Well," he said, "how does it feel?" Kyla hesitated. "It feels big," she admitted. He laughed softly. "It is big, but it's just the first step." Kyla nodded. She knew that now. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something bigger. The following weeks passed in a blur of interviews, events, and meetings. Kyla barely had time to process everything before the next wave of attention hit. News stations ran her story on repeat, calling her a symbol of justice and the voice of a generation. Social media exploded with hashtags, #JusticeForKyla and #ChangeStartsNow, and messages poured in from people all over the country. Some shared their own experiences, stories of discrimination and fear. Others simply thanked her for speaking out. One message stuck with her more than the others. A girl her age named Maya wrote, "Because of you, I finally told someone what happened to me. I was scared before, but now I feel like I don't have to be. Thank you." Kyla read it over and over, her fingers trembling as she typed out a response. "I'm proud of you," she wrote. "We're stronger together." But not all the attention was positive. Critics flooded comment sections and forums accusing Kyla of exaggerating, of playing the victim, even of exploiting the situation for fame. Some dismissed Obama's involvement as a publicity stunt. Others questioned whether the officers really deserved such harsh punishments. Kyla tried not to read the comments, but sometimes they slipped through. Each one stung, reopening wounds she thought were healing. Obama called her one evening after one particularly cruel post had gone viral. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," Kyla admitted. "I thought it would feel better, but now it's like people hate me." "Not people," he corrected gently. "Just some people. And that's always going to happen when you stand up for what's right. But you can't let them drown out the voices that matter, the ones you're helping." She wanted to believe him, but it wasn't always easy. To keep herself grounded, Kyla threw herself into her art. Her sketches changed, becoming bolder and more emotional. She drew faces filled with anger, sadness, hope, expressions that reflected everything she'd felt and seen over the past few months. When a local art gallery invited her to display her work, Kyla hesitated. The idea of so many people seeing her art, of opening herself up again, terrified her. But Obama convinced her to do it. "This isn't just about you anymore," he reminded her. "It's about giving people something to hold on to, something to believe in." The opening night of the gallery felt as nerve-wracking as her speech at the rally. Cameras flashed, voices hummed, and Kyla gripped the wheels of her chair so tightly her fingers ached. But when the doors opened and people began walking through, she saw something unexpected: tears. Strangers stopped to look at her drawings, their eyes wide with emotion. Some took photos, others just stood silently. One woman, holding her daughter's hand, knelt down and whispered, "Thank you." By the end of the night, Kyla felt something shift inside her. Her voice wasn't just in speeches anymore, it was in her art, and it was reaching people. But there was still more work to do. Obama continued to mentor Kyla, encouraging her to use her platform to push for reform. She met with lawmakers, attended meetings about police accountability, and even testified before a congressional committee about her experience. It wasn't easy. The meetings were long and filled with debates that felt endless. Progress was slow, and sometimes it felt like nothing was changing. But then there were moments that reminded her why she was doing it. Like the day Congress passed a bill requiring stricter training for police officers dealing with minors and people with disabilities. Obama called her as soon as it passed. "This is because of you," he said. Kyla shook her head. "No, it's because of us." The months turned into a year, and Kyla's life kept changing. She still went to school, still hung out with her friends, still spent afternoons drawing in the park. But she was also traveling, speaking at events, and inspiring others to stand up for themselves. Her sketchbook became a symbol, not just of her talent, but of her resilience. One of her drawings, a portrait of Obama crouching beside her in the park, ended up on the cover of a national magazine. When she saw it for the first time, she cried. Not because of what it meant for her, but because of what it meant for everyone who had ever felt powerless. One afternoon, Kyla sat in that same park where everything had started, watching kids play and families laugh. The fountain sparkled in the sunlight, and her fingers itched to start drawing again. Obama's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Back to where it all began?" he asked, smiling as he walked up. Kyla grinned. "It feels different now." "Good different?" "Yeah," she said, "good different." They sat together for a while, watching the world move around them. Then Obama turned to her. "You've done a lot," he said, "but there's still more to do." "I know," Kyla said. "I'm ready." And she meant it. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't just a girl in a wheelchair. She was an artist, an activist, a voice for change, and this time the world was listening. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Your support helps tell important stories. Watch other videos on our channel. There are many more thought-provoking topics. Leave comments and tell us where you're watching from. We value your opinion.